Hi, Julia. Hi, Jeremiah.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I am super excited to have this conversation with you guys today. For our listeners, we've been talking a lot about purity culture. And as I was researching this topic, starting probably in like December, January of 2025, I did a lot of thinking and processing about how it affected me. And then there came a point when I was like, man, this shows up in so many ways in my relationships. And it took me a minute to find people that were talking about how it shows up in relationships. There are a ton of resources about, especially women and their experiences in purity culture, how they kind of healed from that and processed it, but not a lot on how it shows up in our relationships. And so I can't remember how I found you guys. It might have been through the Sunday School Dropout podcast, possibly. Anyway,
Oh,
Yeah, that's a
yes.
I
good one.
found you guys and I was like, oh, yeah, are talking about all the questions I have. So I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation about relationships today and how purity culture might affect them. So I will turn it over to you if you guys want to introduce yourselves. That would be awesome.
Perfect. I can start. First of all, thank you, Shanna. That's a really kind introduction, and we are excited to chat with you as well. My name is Julia, and currently in my professional life, I'm a certified sex therapist, and I'm a relationship therapist. So I work along the intersection of religious trauma, sexuality, and relationships. And I have a story that is probably very familiar to people who are listening. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian community. Purity culture dictated my world. And I mean that in quite a literal sense,
Mm.
not a hyperbolic sense. I got married quite young, and that was something that my community celebrated. I experienced that rite of passage. Frankly, I was very excited for the honeymoon sex that was promised to me. And also, probably unsurprising if you were listening to this, I didn't receive the honeymoon sex that was promised, and I didn't receive a whole lot of things that my church community promised. And that was a crisis in my life. At the time, I had the idea that my story was very unique because the evangelical deconstructing world was not developed in the way that it was today. And I didn't have anyone in my community who could understand, appreciate, or relate to my story. So it was a very isolating, devastating experience. And after going through my own sex therapy, after going through my own relationship therapy, I learned that my story was actually really not unique. And that was heartbreaking in its own
Mm.
way, because what that meant and what that means is that we have systemic religious structures that are robbing children, adolescents, young adults, and adults of all ages of like the sexuality and relationship flourishing that I believe as humans we are all worthy to engage.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add my own story, so I'm Jeremiah. Like Julia, I am a relationship therapist, certified sex therapist through the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, or ASECT. ASECT is the premier organization in our country around about sex therapy, sex counselor education. I really appreciate, Shanna, what you were saying about the suppose gap of information about how purity culture impacts relationships. As Julia and I began doing our own deconstruction work individually, and then we met and we started a podcast and we started talking about this, we started realizing that so much of the restrictive messages around bodies, around behaviors, are not just around like the performance of gender and restrictions of gender, not just around restrictions around identity, relationship structure, preferred relationship structures, those things, but they all happen in relationships. Like you, Julia, I got married way too young in a wedding that was celebrated by 200 people, many of whom attended the church that I worked at for 5 years.
Okay.
My first career is in music ministry in Churches of Christ, which is its own kind of weird little
Okay.
denomination within the larger evangelical umbrella, even though they would funnily reject the idea that
Mm.
they're evangelical.
Okay.
Whole other conversation. I learned a lot of similar messages, Julia, that you described, except the other way around. Being the
Mm.
male, I was expected to be in positions of leadership, to be dominant, to make unilateral decisions on
Mm.
behalf of the family, on behalf of the relationship system. Some of those I performed pretty well. I have a lifelong relationship with ending up in leadership positions, some of which I put myself in, some of which I just like end up in. And I also, in my marriage to my ex, did a lot of things pretty poorly. I was
Mm.
not especially collaborative. I was not a great administrator. I left a lot of the traditional gender role things to my ex. And the end result of that was a relationship that stopped working. It stopped working
Mm.
long after we had officially named that it stopped working. So, one of the things that's really important for me with our podcast, with the work that we do, is knowing, Julia, like what you said, like I'm not alone in this. There's a growing ecosystem of voices of people who are naming the ways that religious fundamentalism hurts them, limits them, restricts them. And as someone who studies communication, as someone who studies relationship therapy, wanted to see how I could help other people not make the same mistakes I did.
Yeah.
That's really great. And I love how you talked about just letting people know they're not alone. That's something
Yeah.
that I love too. And I know it's helped me so much because I think when we think we're alone, at least for me, then we internalize whatever's happening, whatever's wrong as our fault. And there's so much shame attached to it, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to move forward when you're stuck in that shame.
Well, and Shanna, shame is not just an emotional experience, it's a communication experience too. It's
Mm,
an avoidance, and it's an extreme avoidance rooted in this idea that I am a bad person, I did
yeah,
something wrong,
right.
and avoiding the vulnerability of testing that. So yeah, that happens a lot of avoidance in relationships that we work with.
Interesting.
I would also add, though, a forced avoidance.
Yeah.
Hmm.
People in shame choose to avoid. I can think of
Mm,
many examples. I would say for folks within religious structures, sometimes the avoidance is enforced in the sense that spaces don't exist
sure.
Mm,
to be able to discuss, feel, receive accurate information, and they might not actually have an option
Yeah.
to engage in a way that's safe or healthy.
Yeah.
And that's really devastating in its own
yeah.
way.
Or the language, I think. Like we didn't even have, or for myself, like the language to know what I was missing or what questions to
Yeah,
ask. And actually, this
totally.
leads right into the question I wanted to ask you guys to start out is there was this incredible silence around sexuality, right? Other than don't do it. That was pretty much the only message that we had. And so we don't have the skills, we don't have the language, we didn't have the spaces to talk about these things in a healthy way. And so it's hard to start doing that. And I would love to hear from you guys what advice you have, or based with your own experience, on starting to talk about these things that are hard to talk about that we haven't had a lot of practice with.
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider is in general, what is a healthy relationship? We talked in our second season of Sex Evangelicals about, oh, sorry, third season, excuse me, our third season of Sex Evangelicals was called Partnership Building, in which
Okay.
we talked about the work of the couples researcher John Gottman
Mhm.
and his sound marital house theory. So take a minute, Google sound marital house. John Gottman. Gottman is two T's. To pull up an image of this, but it talks about kind of 7 levels of foundations to build in a healthy, sustainable relationship. And this is even before we include sex and sexuality into this.
Okay.
The first one he calls love maps, which is an ongoing understanding of the personality traits, interests, strengths, and values of our partners, and an expectation that these will change over time. And so,
Mm.
because these will change over time, we have a responsibility to our partners to continue to get to learn about them, to continue to get to know about them. High control religious groups tend to suggest that healthy relationships are about the performance of rigidly described gender roles and monogamous structures, rather than the specific way that two people make agreements based off of what they learn about each other over time. So having an understanding about who our partner is helps us make agreements and arrangements that work best for the particular relationship at that given time. We didn't learn that in purity culture.
We didn't learn any skills to communicate or to disagree in a healthy way.
That's right. That's right. Right, because and this is the second level, sharing fondness and admiration. High control religious groups encourage that, so long as your behaviors or your wants and needs align with the values of the religious system. As you said, Shanna, as soon as there's disagreement, either between two people or between a person and the values of the religious system, that's seen as a threat.
Yeah.
And the religious system encourages, whatever can happen to ensure that that threat gets eliminated, either through kind of a forced conformity, typically speaking, the woman being expected to go along with what the man wants, or criticism, name calling, those types of things, rather than an understanding and hopefully a celebration of what those differences might be.
You were talking about avoidance. Do you think in that aspect there is like shutting down if there's a problem or a question that arises? How does that work?
Oh, I would definitely say yes. I think often people don't know how to even give language to what their experiences might be. When I cried every day on my honeymoon, I didn't have any language for that. I tried, but I fumbled my way through that. So that's one example of a shutdown due to lack of language, lack of skills to engage. And then other times, maybe we do have a sense of the thing that could be useful to discuss. And it can be really scary because bringing up that thing, such as, oh, wow, I'm really unsure about this marriage, and my entire life was rooted in marriage being like the ultimate good. Then sometimes there's a shutting down because it is understandably too scary. So I would say that those are two primary ways that the shutdown happens.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with me. Things being too scary to even go there.
Well, and Julia, even as you were talking about that, the idea of scary is rooted in the idea of fear, rooted in an emotion. And one of the things that we also learn is that emotions are problems. Emotions are problems to be fixed in some capacity, rather than emotions just being another way to share information about oneself.
Right.
And to get a bigger sense of understanding.
Yeah.
So, and that typically, I was going to say that typically falls along gender lines, although I think that men try to solve the emotions of women in different ways than women try to solve the emotions of men, primarily because men and women are socialized to experience two different types of emotions.
Right. Not because men and women are inherently different in their emotional experiences, but because we learn how to be boys, how to be girls, how to be women, how to be men. So sometimes we can notice those trends.
Yeah, no, that resonates. My husband and I, we talk now after we've left, but we both had so many things and doubts, for several years. But again, it was too scary to bring them out into the open and really talk about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jeremiah, did you have some more pieces to that partnership building house you wanted to go through? Or?
Yeah. Let me name one more.
Yeah.
The third level is turning toward instead of turning away. And this actually kind of ties into what we were talking about. And high control systems, turning toward is often an attempt to either try to get the other person to conform or eliminate whatever emotional experience the other person is having. Turning toward to fix a problem that may not actually be a problem, as opposed to learning more about and celebrating the differences that the other person has. So, I actually think evangelical systems teach its members to turn towards partners, but maybe for different reasons, more for the sake of conformity and kind of enmeshment unity, rather than how can we kind of hold on to some potential different experiences that we're having.
Do you have an example of that at all, or an experience that you could share?
What's the smile?
No, I feel like we've had a handful of those
in our
types of
relationship.
experiences in our relationship.
You could share as an example.
Sure. I mean, even today a little bit as we are talking about, as we're talking about our own business and some of the emotional things that come up for both of us. Like, Julia, I think that you have more of a tendency to tap into some of the existential angst and fear, and I have more of an ability to, like, I'm aware of it, but I'm more quickly, not necessarily more effectively, but more quickly move into the land of like solutions. What are we going to do
Okay.
about it? And I think we've clashed about that in the past. I actually think today, this morning especially, like, we did really well navigating that.
Yeah, I agree.
But that's kind of an ongoing tension between the two of us. How do we have room for both experiences without the other person feeling like, we're steamrolling the other person or pulling up the emergency brake when maybe just tapping the brakes is actually more necessary, or a variety of different options I think they come with.
Yeah. And if you don't have the skills to navigate differences that are a little bit like less loaded, lower stakes,
Sure.
then something like sexuality is probably very off limits.
Totally.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. So there was so much silence about sex and purity culture, right? But at the same time, especially for women, and girls actually, we were over sexualized. So it's a very strange dynamic. And I've also learned as I've been reading, and I don't know how widespread this is in purity culture, maybe you could speak to it a little bit, that the church could overemphasize, and I think you mentioned it, like this honeymoon sex, or this idea that having the positive sexual experience once you're finally together is like the pinnacle or a measure of success, let's say, of the relationship. And then it can be tricky when we're going into it unexperienced. And how do we navigate this? What other things do we need to be thinking about as far as a healthy relationship? What does that look like? And a successful relationship, what does that look like? There's, I'm guessing, more aspects of the relationship than we really talked about or learned about.
Yeah. I would reinforce what you just mentioned, Jeremiah, around like very basic, which doesn't mean easy, relational health skills. And John Gottman is probably the best known relationship researcher in terms of what are the foundational building blocks that a couple, and sometimes when couples who have left a high control religious group come to therapy, sometimes we have to take 10 steps back, not because they aren't competent, mature, full-fledged adults, but because, to your point, Jeremiah, they might not have known how to disagree well. And actually, Shanna, that was something you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Going back to really prime communication strategies is important. And then we use those as building blocks. That's a little bit, I hope that's a helpful answer. I recognize that the answer is a little bit vague because there is so much to unlearn and relearn, but probably the first step would be, how do you even have a conversation well, especially when it's something sticky, something vulnerable, something that you might disagree with? And how can you slow down the conversation, focus on hearing each other, repeating back what you hear, and focusing on understanding before you move into any kind of problem solving or agreement making? That might be a more helpful answer in the sense that it's actually something that you could take away when a topic is loaded or we disagree. We want to defend our opinion and find a good way forward. And probably the best step is having a conversation in which the only goal is to understand the other person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I hope that's a helpful answer.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I've been learning about that in therapy as well. And even the simple piece of learning how to really listen to someone and validate what they're saying, right? Like
Yeah.
that for me, it was big because it's like what we've been talking about. It's learning that you can validate somebody, say, I get what you're saying, I get how you're feeling, if you don't agree with them.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Like, theme that's come up over the past 3 weeks with many of my couples is you can empathize and you don't need to agree. And so often within high control religious structures, agreement was paramount.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Disagreement was or is a sign that the relationship is in trouble, failing, struggling. However, disagreement is inevitable. Often that's really helpful, really healthy. And being able to empathize, even when you don't agree, is basic, yet in practice, very, very challenging to do. Like it is a skill that takes time to develop.
It's so hard because I think what we've been taught somehow is if you validate someone else's point of view, then you're not holding to your own beliefs, right? Like if you think about it in the context of the church and the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if I say those people, oh, I get why you're doing what you're doing, then I feel like, oh, well, that's doubting what I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, is in competition or comparison to another person. And
Right.
that's the way that the threads that connect us work, as opposed to the threads that connect each of us being about, hey, like we're all trying to survive the hardships of the world together. You know, you have one way of doing it, I have one way of doing
Yeah.
it, and let's figure out a way to learn from each other about it.
Yeah. The space for both things, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What other things have you seen that have shown up that we probably missed in our relationship development in high control religion and purity culture?
Well, let's talk a little bit about sex and how we can once, I'm going to put this in big quotes here, once sex becomes sanctioned,
Hmm.
assuming that it ever needed to be sanctioned, at least according to the terms that the evangelical church sanction it, along marital values, heterosexual values, those types of things, is relearning that sexuality and sexual health has way more to do with the values that we have. So, how we want to do a sexual relationship. And that the behaviors that we do come out of the values that we choose for
Interesting.
ourselves rather than the other way around. Abstinence only, purity culture suggests, Shanna, very much like you said, don't do this, don't do this. The behaviors are the things that are communicated first, and we don't really have a chance to work back to figuring out what works best for us. Because if we make that move, then we're sinning. Then we're considered to be bad people and are chewed up pieces of bubble gum and whatever other
Uh-huh.
awful metaphors got used to describe those who didn't adhere to the models of abstinence only. So some of the values then, Julia, that you and I talk about then are, first of all, consent, that sexuality is a communication, is an ongoing dialogue between two people or more people if you are interested in having multiple types of relationships. It's an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing conversation in which both people show up. And if one person doesn't show up, especially in a new relationship, that means sex is off the table.
Mhm.
In long-term relationships, if another person isn't able to access sexuality, how can a couple find other ways then to connect, to find pleasure, to find rest, to find joy, some of those things that
Yeah.
sexuality can provide for us. Sexuality feels good for both people. Pleasure and the pleasure of both and all people are involved. That's an important value that we and if we start with that value and then the behavior, that opens us up to a whole bunch of different options for what sex could look like. Especially if we're honest with ourselves and with our partners about what feels good for us, and that we're thinking about sex as something that we do for ourselves before we think about sex as something that we do for our partners.
Interesting.
I
That's
think
very
that's
different from the messages we heard in the church.
well, right, especially for women.
Yes.
Men often learn that sex is performed for men, as opposed to for the own sexual pleasures of a woman.
Or for the relationship.
Sure,
For
absolutely.
the relationship. Yeah.
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 So Julia, like as a woman, how did you start making that shift?
Good question.
Making the shift from the messages, the harmful messages that we've described, to something that Jeremiah has described.
Yeah, like that sexuality was for you and
Mm.
not just like for the relationship or for your partner.
Yeah, that shift occurred in multiple stages over a long period of time. A big part of that for me was professional sex therapy from a secular therapist. And a huge part of that therapy was some basic but again, not easy psychoeducation and sexual health education. So I'm happy to share with you, to put in show notes some
Hmm.
resources for folks who might
Yeah.
need some really good sex education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Erica Smith is the person who
Okay.
immediately comes to mind. She is a sex educator, and her primary specialty is working with folks who have left high control religious groups. So her sex education course, I believe, is called Purity Culture Dropout.
Okay.
Now, again, the deconstruction world wasn't as prolific when I was in that when I was in my own deconstruction than it is now. But the education from a therapist who was not tied to a religious group was a really important part of
Mm.
that. And then over time, it took a lot of practice. And I would say it takes a lot of practice. The vestiges of purity culture still show up in my life today. I imagine
Hmm.
they will in the future,
Sure.
which I don't say hopelessly. I say that realistically. And also, that can take us off the hook a little bit.
Yeah.
Because when they do show up, we don't need to feel badly. We don't need to feel even more shame that it is still difficult.
Thank you for sharing that and being so honest about that.
Yeah. Yeah, aside from education, a big part has been talking
Mm.
with my partner, and I am divorced. So the partner that I have now, Jeremiah, we have conversations about sexuality in a way that I didn't with my
Hmm.
ex-husband. Not because we didn't want to, but because we didn't have the skills, tools,
Hmm.
or
Yeah.
resources to do that.
Same.
Yeah.
Something that you had mentioned, Shanna, in your email, and that you mentioned a few minutes ago, was this idea that sexuality is like everything in evangelical structures. And when I got married, I received the message that, well, sex will just be hard and it probably isn't going
Mm.
to be great for you, but honeymoon sex will also be the best experience of your life. And also, if you ever stop having sex or sex is difficult or challenging or just less frequent, that is somehow a failure in the relationship.
Mm.
And to go back to Jeremiah's point, a big thing that I teach couples and discuss in therapy is that your sexual relationship will inevitably ebb and flow. And not
Mm.
only is that inevitable, that's actually just healthy. That
Mm.
speaks to other ways that the relationship is growing, evolving, and developing.
Yeah.
And that sexuality is one part of the relationship, and
Right.
it isn't the marker for success in any
Yeah.
way. So we can also let ourselves off the hook a little bit in that regard too.
Yeah. These are conversations we've never heard, what
Yeah.
it's really like in normal,
Yeah.
typical relationships.
Yeah. In
I
my
feel because there's not a lot of talk about it, right? You get married, and as long as it's someone in the church, you're good to go. And you put
Right.
God first, and your relationship will be solid forever.
Right. And I remember in my premarital course, it was called Becoming One, which is a fairly problematic title. And one of the discussion points was that one of the many reasons that not being sexual before you got married was important was because after you got married, you would never not be sexual. And literally, the message I received is this is the only time in your relationship that you will not be sexual,
Hmm.
which is baffling to me now because there are a whole myriad of reasons that a couple may or may not be sexual or
Right.
have more frequency or less frequency. And some of them might be challenges that a couple is
Mhm.
experiencing, and other reasons might not be bad or problematic or rooted in a challenge either. And
Right.
so that message that you will always be having consistently great sex with your partner, like that's a really big one to debunk.
That is huge. And I think that's also in the broader culture too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember
Yeah.
watching an episode last year of St. Denis Medical, which is a hospital sitcom. And one of the plot lines was that a nurse, one of the primary characters, hadn't had sex with her husband in a really, like, in a long time, whatever
Mm.
long time means. I don't know if they defined it. And all of the coworkers were like, wow, your marriage must be really slipping. I can't believe you haven't been having sex. Are you attracted to each other? Divorce is probably looming. And we could unpack a whole, like we could unpack a lot of things in what I just said. And then they do have sex at the end of the episode. And it's like, well, thank God the relationship is okay. And so, like, even this ending that you would hope to be like connective and sweet and like warm-hearted, like reinforce this idea that the couple is okay because now
Yeah.
they've had sex.
That's interesting. It's not just in the churches that we're hearing these messages.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes the messages are shockingly similar in pop
Right.
culture versus church culture, maybe just a different shade of lipstick.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So I wanted to bring this up because it's been a big challenge for a lot of folks leaving our church is when one person in the partnership leaves and starts down the road of deconstruction, and the other person maybe isn't at all or is further behind. I think you guys understand it's super, super hard. So I wanted to throw this out there to you for those folks to see what advice you could give. Yeah, I don't even know what to ask. I just know that it's really, really hard.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to deconstruction in an ongoing relationship, it's pretty inevitable that one person is going to be moving faster than the other. One person gains information, listens to a podcast, reads a book, sees a movie that the other person doesn't have access to. And that in and of itself is a thing that, so to speak, kind of launches a person ahead of the other person. That person might have either more information or different kinds of information, and they are starting to gather resources from outside of the evangelical umbrella as well. And I think that a couple things, and this is true with family members as well.
Yeah, I think all of us are experiencing this to some
Yeah,
extent.
Yeah.
I think kind of two things come into mind when thinking about this question. The first one is I think that the dyad has to make agreements that proselytizing is off the table. I am not trying to get you to change your mind. I'm not trying
In
to get
both directions.
right.
Yeah.
Which is hard because evangelicalism is all about proselytizing. We learn that we are good Christians by how many people we baptize, by how well we sell the gospel. Evangelicalism is at the end of the day like marketing a religion. And we're all taught different types of marketing skills, how to be persuasive in different ways, in ways that can really interfere with relationships. So one of the first things is I'm not trying to get you to change your mind, not because I don't care, but because like we know with cult studies, we know with social media studies, the attempt of a loved one to try to change the mind of the other person, it doesn't work. In fact, the other person will often dig their heels in a little bit more. We can be curious. We can learn more about the content that another person is engaging. But the curious questions have to be along the lines of, "Hey, tell me more about what you're learning. What do what did you experience from this content? How did this help you grow?" And not along the lines of, "What the hell are you thinking?" like anything
Right.
to do to avoid those types of questions. So rules against proselytizing, I think, are really, really important. The other thing that I'd encourage folks to think about is really centering their relationships around what they have in common, what they do have in common. This is something I wish that my ex and I had done a little bit better. Our relationship centered actually around music ministry, around worship ministry. That was a thing that was a common thing. We did worship ministry together in our early 20s that continued through some church work. And when I worked at a church in my early to mid 30s, and when I got fired from that position, like I remember my ex saying, "Hey, like this is the last thing that we have in common." And maybe that was true, maybe that wasn't true. I don't think that that was actually true, but I think that that spoke to the fact that we didn't really do a lot to focus a lot on the things that we had in common, even as we were kind of growing in different ways, in different directions. So that would be something that I'd really encourage folks to explore. Like relationships have all sorts of functions, right? Parenting is a common function, shared financial values, like what are we working, what are financial goals we're working towards, companionship, like all sorts of different functions. And so, if we have an experience, let's say where one person is not just leaving the church, but is gathering more information about or different kinds of information about sexuality, right? Like how can we then redefine together what ideas we do have in common about sexuality? What do we want to hold on to together?
It's really helpful.
Yeah. That's such a good question. And I can also relate to this professionally. I have several clients in this experience right now and personally because I experienced this with my ex-husband as well. I don't think I handled this part of my relationship with my ex-husband very well. And without criticism towards him, I don't think he did either. I say that again to reinforce that we really didn't have skills, tools, or resources to navigate something like this. And it can be helpful to name this as a crisis. And not to name it as a crisis with a reason to panic, but to be able to say, this is a really big deal. And just like any other crisis, let's solidify our foundation and see what options we can have together. To go back to something that you had mentioned, actually all three of us had mentioned earlier around basic communication, I would suggest that couples set up some structured conversations in which they can focus on what one person is experiencing. So if I were to use the case with my former marriage, what would have been really helpful is if my ex-husband had said, wow, you've made some really significant shifts in your worldview. And I'm hearing that you have like questions and doubts and concerns. Could we sit down and for half an hour, 45 minutes, could you tell me about what's happening for you? And I'm going to ask you questions and I'm going to reflect what I'm hearing. And that's going to be the point of the conversation. And I would make it as specific as possible. So a book that I read that many people read was Pure by Linda K. Klein. So my ex-husband could have said, wow, this book was really fantastic, like really impactful for you. Tell me what you learned. Tell me what stood out, rather than, you're deconstructing like what's going on with you. That might be too big, but to focus on a part of your story. Hey, sex has been really challenging. You're reckoning with purity culture. Could we talk about this specific aspect of it? That would have slowed down the escalation that both of us were experiencing for different reasons. And then it would have been equally helpful if I had said, hey, I bet this is really scary for you. Our foundation was based on these Christian values and this shared mission and vision together. And now I don't know. I'm expressing to you that I don't know if that's something that works in my life any longer. I bet you're scared. Or I imagine that you're scared. I don't know if that's true. Can we sit down for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and I'm going to ask you about it and you're going to tell me about it. And that's going to be the point of the conversation. So before moving into solutions or next steps or agreements, you might have some structured conversations with a partner, and it will be really challenging to hold back your own distress, right? Because if my ex-husband is telling me about how scared he is that I'm experiencing this growth, I'm going to have a lot of feelings about that.
Right.
And as I'm talking about my questions about sexuality, he's going to have a lot of feelings about that. And so it's going to be really challenging to have something that we have set up, pretty basically, but it's going to take a whole lot of work to do well.
Yeah.
So how do you guide your clients in that then? Like, should they set up anything like in the time around those conversations? Like I know that those are very challenging when you're sitting with all of those big feelings. What do you advise folks to do?
Yeah. The first would be to pick the specific topic.
Yeah.
What the outcome of the or the goal of the conversation will be. In this case, both of us would suggest understanding a specific thing about the other person. Make an agreement.
So no like relationship solution in that moment.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. Choosing a time and a place where both of you can be engaged and as grounded as possible. And that might be sitting next to or sitting facing each other on the couch. That might be on a walk. It might be in a public space because you can't self-regulate well at home. Whatever you need to do, but make the agreement. This is the time, this is the place, this is the topic, and set a timer. I said 30 or 45 minutes. That might be way too long. For some people, that's a little bit arbitrary. It depends on a whole host of factors. And just like when we talk about sexuality, we talk just as much about the before care and the after care as the actual sexual experience. So do what you need to do before a hard conversation. For me, that's probably exercise. because I come into a hard situation better if I've moved my body. It could be a whole host of things for different people. So do what you need to do individually before that conversation. And then I would say plan something connective with your partner after, and make the agreement that the conversation ends when you agreed. And it might mean a walk, it might mean your favorite game, it might mean a relaxing TV show or anything, but make sure that you've got something that can re-solidify your connection after that hard conversation.
It's really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree, Julia, with everything that you said. The other thing that I would add is tagging onto something you said before, which is going slow. And the importance that this is one of the hard parts about the deconstruction and about the individuation process is that there can be an enormous sense of urgency to make up for lost time, urgency to access something because like it's been scarce for the totality of your life. And typically speaking, when we experience something that we haven't before after a period of scarcity, like we want to like gobble it up. So making sure that we pace ourselves, that these are slow types of interactions. I appreciate the ways, Julia, that you talked about setting up some of the structures around that. The other thing to consider is that high control religious groups tend to leave you with two options. There's a way to perform masculinity, and then there's all the other ways. There's a specific way that a healthy marriage should look, and then there's everything else. So part of the deconstruction process of leaving high control religious spaces is recognizing that, your options have just jumped from two options to like 50 options. And that in and of itself can be really overwhelming. And so the other thing that I would add, Julia, along with kind of naming the topic that you want to talk about, is giving yourself permission to put all the options on the table. And so when it comes to sex, for instance, there's actually some really good assessments and really good interventions that talk about, what are some specific sexual options that you have. Let's put them all on the table. We're not immediately eliminating any of them, and then maybe having a conversation with the other person. Maybe one of the conversations that you schedule is, hey, like, what are things that feel good for your body outside of intercourse? Great. So then we talk about that for a little bit. What are sex toys that we might want to like include into this? Okay, we have a little conversation about that. But that might happen over the course of months, years, and that's just as it pertains to sexuality.
Yeah. And those are, again, is all going back to communication, right? Like having the ability and the skills to have those conversations, grounded in those conversations.
For sure. And I think that, Julia, the organizational structure that you set up is a good way is a good way for the relationship to help to create that sense of focus and to manage the overwhelm that might come up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because you keep it to smaller chunks rather than you need to spend a day discussing something, right?
Right. And I think even in full disclosure, as you were asking the question, Shanna, I think in my own mind, I actually jumped to a binary. And what I mean by that is with folks deconstructing and one person is deconstructing faster or the other person is deconstructing slower or recommitting to a specific religious group, my mind jumped to the decision about whether the relationship decides to stay together or not stay together. And that is often a conversation that people do have.
Yeah.
However, that probably isn't the first conversation, right? And so you might be having all kinds of conversations like this along the way. Maybe the big question is, how sustainable is our relationship? Or maybe the big question is, sex really hasn't worked for us this whole time that we've been together. What options do we have? Or one of us is really invested in a religious community and the other person isn't. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is on the brink of any kind of dissolution. What's the word? Dissolution. And so I'm glad, Jeremiah, that you gave the examples that you gave, because my immediate thought was, oh, the big conversation around deconstruction. Do we stay married or do we not stay married?
Julia, I appreciate the way that you said that, because that's the way that the church sets
Yeah.
up kind of
Yeah.
relationship status. And I mean, our census sets up relationship status. Married, single, divorced, widowed. Like, are you married or are you not? And if you aren't married,
Mm.
why? As opposed to, okay, so you have a relationship, you have a commit, you have an ongoing person that you keep coming back to. What are the functions of that? And it doesn't have to be all the functions. Mr. Perel talks about this in the book Mating in Captivity, that actually putting too many functions, too many expectations on a relationship actually
Mm.
increases anxiety. So what happens if, let's say, that relational connection is something that's really important to you, or emotional connection? What happens if you rely on multiple relationships to get that? Your partner plays that role, but also, your best friend plays that role. Your neighbor upstairs plays that role. You find other people to do fun things, and it's okay that your partner isn't part of that. And that doesn't mean that your relationship sucks.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good point. And I think that being able to name that staying married isn't the ultimate sign of success
That's right.
actually allows you to explore many, many, many different kinds of options. I worked with a couple who, when we finished therapy, were doing absolutely fantastic. And in the course of our work together, we referenced the Christmas light conversation. And what we meant by that was they were hanging up Christmas lights. And while they were hanging up Christmas lights, they were like, we could get divorced. And it was this idea that the worst thing that they learned could happen to the relationship
Right.
was like actually an okay option, and it didn't mean failure.
That's right.
And I actually think, while we want to get out of the binary, being able to name the worst thing as not the worst thing gives you permission to explore a whole host of other structures,
Other
a whole host of
options.
other ways that the relationship could exist. I'm divorced, and that was a decision. That doesn't mean my previous marriage was a failure or that I'm a failure. However, that you might have more options than you think is what I'm trying to express.
And I wrote this. I'm glad that you mentioned that case, because I wrote a version of this in my notes. Thinking about another example, thinking about suicide, for instance, and what we do for suicide prevention. One of the ways to help people navigate suicide prevention and to potentially talk themselves off the ledge is to consider suicide to be an option, that many options that a person can choose to do. And lean into that and ask about it, and ask about ideation and plans. Like, just because you talk about suicidal ideation or plan, that doesn't mean you're going to do it.
Actually, you'll be less, in the case of suicide, you'll be less likely.
That's correct. And I've often found that when a couple can be honest about considering divorce as an option and not letting the anxiety and panic come over, they actually move away from divorce. Because if you can talk about something really scary, really stressful like divorce, you can talk about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And often couples who make that move do talk about all sorts of things, including a pathway towards what a relationship and a relationship structure and agreements look like that works for both people in the relationship at that time.
Yeah, I really love that you both brought this up, because that's such a huge part of learning after we leave high control religion, is really trying to move away from the black and white, only two options, right? And that's a hard one, and it shows up, like you said, in our relationships too. Because you were both mentioning this, I wanted to circle back a little bit. You mentioned individuation, and then I think, Julia, you were talking about, as we're like exploring and moving out and trying new things. One thing I found really helpful from your podcast was actually learning for the first time about the steps a relationship will go through, and that there's some natural like fusing, moving apart, coming back together. Because I think the image that the church and culture in general presented when I was a young girl was, you will find your soulmate and your Prince Charming and you will be happy forever and there'll never be any more problems, right? Twin flames. Oh my goodness, yeah.
Gosh.
Another great cult documentary.
Another great cult documentary. So I would love if you could share a little bit about just some education around relationships and what that can look like.
But what specific?
Like the stages, like
Stages
the
of
individual, the stages of development of a relationship.
Sure. I mean, Jen, I think that you named them. I think you named kind of a relationship starts by finding its commonalities through
Hmm.
bonding. A couple of years into a relationship, ideally, there's a process of not just individuation, but differentiation.
Okay. And
So,
what does that mean exactly?
so,
Differentiation.
so individuation is the idea of one person discovering what their own interests, what their own personality traits, like what they might enjoy about certain things, independent from what a larger culture is telling them to do. So a religious group or a
Or their
family of
partner.
origin or their partner. That's right.
Yeah.
Differentiation is a relational process that involves two people being able to simultaneously hold on to their own emotional reactions while celebrating and being curious about some of the differences of their partners.
Do you find any of that gets arrested in
Oh,
high
Oh,
control
absolutely.
groups?
yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Okay.
Because differentiation is the ability to hold on to oneself and hold on to the
Mm.
relationship with a sense of interdependence. Jeremiah and I are both trained in the same model of therapy, which
Yeah.
follows the
Yeah.
stages of development that Jeremiah describes. Something really important in the model of therapy that we use is both self differentiation and relationship
Yeah.
differentiation,
Mm.
and both get stunted in high control religious groups. Self differentiation is the ability to speak for yourself, thoughts, feelings, interests, hopes, dreams, and it sounds obvious. However, when you grow up in a high control religious group, you receive that information.
Right.
You learn what you think, you learn how to feel, you learn the best way to use your time. In some
Hmm.
ways, sometimes interests and hobbies and friendships are prescribed for you.
Yeah.
So self differentiation tends to be really, really low.
Mm.
Relationship differentiation tends to be really low too. Relationship differentiation is the ability to hold space for differences between in a couple, two folks within that relationship system. So I can hold on to myself through self differentiation while also listening to Jeremiah. He might have a thought, a feeling, or an opinion. Maybe it resonates with me, maybe it doesn't, but I can hold on to what he's saying, hold on to my own self, and then figure out a collaborative way to navigate that within the relationship
Mm.
structure. We just discussed how the self differentiation tends to be low. The relationship differentiation tends to be really low too, because we don't learn how to navigate differences. And we learn that enmeshment and symbiosis is the marker of
Hmm.
an important relationship, and that's pretty damaging for the relationship in general. It's
Hmm.
especially damaging for sexuality.
Oh, okay. Can you speak to that a little bit, like why it's especially damaging for sexuality?
Sexuality requires some distance between people.
Hmm.
Esther Perel also talks about this in Mating in Captivity and in some of her other work as well. So Esther Perel would say, we can only be close to the extent that we are distant. Am I quoting that
That's right.
correctly? And so when long-term relationships develop over time, you get a lot of intimacy,
Hmm.
emotional intimacy. You live together, your lives form, so you get a ton of closeness. However, eroticism, which is sexual attraction and
Hmm.
desire between two people, that grows via distance. And so
Hmm.
if your relationship is so close, then you've got no kind of sexuality to come back to.
The only way that you push yourself apart and create distance is by criticizing and pushing the other person
Mm.
away, which then ruptures and threatens the safety element of a relationship.
Mm.
Yeah. And the other thing that was really helpful to me in my learning of this model was that the first 2 years of the relationship, like Jeremiah said, are about bonding. And there's a healthy level of enmeshment there. So the first
Hmm.
2 years look different. Self differentiation, relationship differentiation are very different. Within high control religious structures, folks receive encouragement to get married very quickly.
Hmm.
Now, in my growing up community, both implicitly and explicitly, the rush to get married was driven by sexuality.
Mm.
So that means folks are often meeting, dating, engaged, and married within under 2 years. That was definitely true for me. But you can't assess well in under 2 years the health of the relationship, because you need more than 2 years to move out of bonding and then through a differentiation process.
And to figure out how each person in the relationship will navigate that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know we have to move towards wrapping this up. I did have one more question if you guys have time, or was there something
Totally.
specific you guys wanted to? Okay, so this one is a big one, so we might just have to like hit the highlights, but is the work that men and women need to do after leaving purity culture different? If so, how so? Or is it similar?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of variables to that.
Okay.
I think that there are differences around like personality styles. So we had a couple on our podcast during the partnership building series that in which actually we had two couples on that had a similar thing where the female partner was actually the more dominant, the more assertive person, and the male partner was more kind of passive, observant, type B, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so it depends. Let's say that you have a couple in which it's an opposite sex couple, and then both partners have both bought into the expectations of how their gender is to be performed. So men then are being assertive, being the decision makers, women being kind of the passive recipients, receptacles. There are two relationship shifts then that have to happen. For first one is they have to create a dynamic in which the male partner can initiate his needs and perspectives in a collaborative way. Still being direct, but in a collaborative way, because they've often learned that they can and are expected to make decisions unilaterally, that nobody will check them. And if they do check them, depending on the conservatism of the person, well, like male ideas are superior to female ideas anyway, so we'll kind of shunt women aside because they're supposed to submit to men anyway. So men have to figure out how to have shared conversations with their partner and how to do that in a way that's collaborative and that moves beyond the actual act of, hey, how can we work together to do this? I think it's important for men to take the lead in setting a slower pace. I think it's important for men to initiate, hey, what do you think about this? How does this impact us? Would you mind taking the lead on this conversation? Second dynamic is that they've got to figure out a way for the female partner to just in general initiate her needs and wants in a direct way. And for the male partner who's receiving that to be curious, to lean in, to turn towards, to learn more about, and to not be dismissive. So in a couple where both partners have really bought into the traditional gender roles, those two dynamics I think are two good starts for helping to unlearn and relearn new ways and more diverse ways of engaging and solving problems together. And you can do that using the relationship. You don't have to separate like accountability groups or individual therapy or anything like that. Like that, the relationship can actually be a really good testing ground for that.
And to reiterate something I said earlier, the unlearning and relearning, Jeremiah, that you're describing along gendered lines are an attempt to unlearn some of the socialization.
That's right.
I'm going to say inflicted upon folks because we don't have any good evidence to suggest that men and women are inherently different in these ways. Sure. However, we have a lot of information around the socialization of men and women within high control religious groups. So you aren't trying to unlearn any kind of biological wiring or relearn biological wiring. You're trying to unlearn what were the messages that I learned that weren't helpful to who I am and who do I actually want to be in this relationship.
Yeah.
For sexuality specifically, something that I notice for women is that a big piece of the healing is taking a step back and figuring out what they want in other ways of their life, not related to sexuality. So I use my own life as an example. I don't mean this hyperbolically. If you're not sure what you want to eat for dinner or what you would like to wear or how to use
Yeah.
an hour of free time because everything was prescribed for you, it will be very difficult to learn what you want sexually. So start with very basic questions. What do I actually want to eat for dinner tonight? Can I tap into some physical cues? That's a big piece for women. Anecdotally, what I've learned for men is being able to embrace desire for a partner, because this is probably a self-selected sample size. The men that I see in my office really want to be good men. And they learned that their sexuality was both this uncontrollable urge and temptation from Satan, and they had to fight it with everything in their being. And also, God made them that way. And that's a really big mind F to navigate. And so, a big piece of the work is I'm allowed to desire my partner. I am allowed to see them in a way that's sexual, and that doesn't make me a bad person. I can initiate sex. Initiating sex can be really challenging for men following purity culture.
That's super helpful, you guys. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
of
I
course.
think all of this will be incredibly helpful for our community. So I thank you guys so much for your time. If we can just wrap up, if you want to tell folks how they can find you, if they want to learn more.
Yeah.
I mentioned your podcast at the beginning, but I know you have other ways.
So we're largely on social media through Substack. Our Substack is called Relationship 101, sexevangelicals.substack.com. We offer 2 or 3 free articles per week about the research around relationship, sexuality, communication, all the stuff that the church didn't want us to have. And then paid members can get some commenting privileges. They can also get a free 60-minute consultation with me and Julia.
Okay.
And that happens through our coaching business, which is Let's Heal Together, for folks who are interested in doing more specialized work about their relationship. You can reach out to us online, letshealtogether.com.
Okay. And I'll put those links in the notes too.
Yeah. And even if you are not a subscriber and interested in the free 60-minute consultation, we do offer free 30-minute consultations for folks who want to hear a little bit more about our work. Unlike our experiences in church, we never want to be coercive with our business or the services that we offer. So it's of high value to us that if you are interested in coaching or therapy, depending on the state in which you live, you get full informed consent, and we will take time to tell you all about it. I mentioned that because therapy was really important for me, both individually and relationally in my healing journey. And so you might need some support. And other options aside from us are asect.org, which is the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and they have a whole list of licensed providers in whatever state in which you preside.
That's helpful. I'll put that link in there too. Thank you
Great.
guys so much.
Shanna, thanks so much.